we had an annual Christmas tradition at our house where we read the story of Christmas from the Gospel of Luke, and then we read the night before Christmas, and both of them were sort of in the same vein. You know, they were nice stories, but I didn't really ever think about the fact of were they true or not. And I had the pleasure of being able to go to the Holy Land and visit twice in the last 5 years. And I've been to all these sites and I began to research it. And I began to think that maybe what I should do is look at the historical facts that are given within the gospel. There's an awful lot of facts in the gospel account, and I wanted to see if you couldn't verify those archaeologically. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to take through the whole story, starting with the Annunciation to Mary in the town of Nazareth, and ending with the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, and take a look at each of the facts that are given and see if we can't ascertain how much of that has been found, especially recently archaeologically. So that's the journey we're about to go through. This is the earliest account we have from the Gospel of Luke. It dates to about the 2nd century AD. But the important thing is that Luke was a scientist of his day. And as he says in his gospel, he carefully investigated everything from the beginning as it was handed down from those who were eyewitnesses. So he had that scientific inquiry to try to check out the facts before he even put them down on paper. So let's start with Nazareth, where the story begins. So the gospel says, in the 6th month, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. All right, so that's the story of really the Christmas story begins there. So we have a town mentioned in Galilee called Nazareth. Well, there's a modern day Nazareth. In fact, actually, that's what that picture is there. That's the modern city of Nazareth, which is the largest Palestinian Arab town in all of Israel. But one of the common objections by a lot of biblical critics is that they say there was no town named Nazareth in the 1st century AD. And in fact, a man named Rene Salm wrote a book called The Myth of Nazareth, the invented town of Jesus. And he argued that there wasn't even a city there. However, recently there's been a lot of new discoveries made that not only show that Nazareth was occupied, but they have been dated to the 1st century AD. Now, historically, there was always the Church of the Annunciation. It was built in 1969, and it was built over a one-room cave that had been venerated since the 4th century AD as the home of Mary. That has always been there with not a lot of archaeological proof to the rest of Nazareth. But in the last few years, the Catholic Church decided to build on the land between the Church of the Annunciation and another church, the Church of St. Joseph. And what they uncovered was 2 1st century courtyard houses, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And they have been dated to the 1st century AD based on both the pottery style as well as oil lamps and Herodian period oil lamps, which would have been from 50 BC to 50 AD, are very, very distinctive. They didn't occur before, they didn't occur afterwards. So when you find these associated with the ruins, you know you have a 1st century house. And I'm going to show you these courtyard houses vary in terms of style, but they generally have a entrance leading into a courtyard part of the structure, and then several rooms in the back. And this word trachlean just simply means the big room, and it was used for many different functions. It was also a cooking, a preparation room, all sorts of different things. But you see these several rooms associated with a large courtyard, and invariably there would be built over a cave-like structure, which they used as subterranean storage, especially to keep things like wine and meat cold, because there was no refrigeration during those days. So what has been found is this is the ruins of one of those courtyard houses. Now, it's been built around by modern buildings here, but this part here, and especially that stone wall, appears to be part of the original structure. Now, I call your attention to that stone wall, and it's very well made for the time. And this is one thing that's leading at least one scholar, a man named Ken Dark from Reading University in England, who believes this really could have been the house of Joseph and Mary, because Joseph, we come down in our tradition of calling him a carpenter. But that's not what it says actually in the original Greek that Luke used. A carpenter would have been a tekton, and then followed by a second word, zulon, which means a contractor that deals in wood. Whereas Luke just uses the description of Joseph as being a tekton. So he was a general contractor, if you will, and actually probably more dealt with stone masonry than he did actually carpenter work. And so the evidence of that wall back here is one thing that this Dr. Dark believes may have been his home. That's speculation, but the fact that it dated to the 1st century AD is not. This is the courtyard house that was found in between the two churches, and it's a little hard to see. You can see some of the rooms are here. The courtyard area would have been back over in here, but nonetheless had pottery as well as of these oil lamps that dated to the 1st century. When they built or opened up that area between the two churches, they actually found a paved road that would have been the major street within Nazareth. And then this is the house that's most recently been found. It actually was underneath part of a convent of the Sisters of Nazareth. And they did some construction work, and as they were doing it, they also stumbled onto a 1st century courtyard house, also dated by the pottery and oil lamps. And it's a quite well-to-do one. They don't believe that this would have been something that a man named Joseph would have possibly lived in. This would have been a house that maybe the most leading citizen in all of Nazareth would have had. But just in the last 10 years, there's been all this evidence found that not only was Nazareth there, but it clearly was there during the 1st century AD at the time that the gospel was writing about. All right, the second part of the biblical story then takes place in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, we have many parts that are associated with it. The first part is the decree for taxation. So what the gospel says is, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire world. And this was the first census that took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he was of the line of David. Now, we have a lot of facts that are given here. There's a man named Caesar Augustus. There's a man named Quirinius who's listed as the governor of Syria. And there is a taxation as well as a journey back to the hometown of your family. Now, The first three are Roman-oriented facts that are given. The last one is a Jewish tradition. The Romans did not require people to go back to their family's home city, but in Jewish tradition, that's where you went to be registered and then to be taxed. So the critics have argued a number of things. They have said that there's no census that was taken around the time of Jesus' birth, which has ranged from anywhere from 4 or 5 BC to 1 or 2 AD. People don't really know for sure, but the general consensus is that it was around 3 or 4 BC, and that Quirinius was not a governor located in Syria. Now, a lot of this has to do with a copying error that occurred in the book on the history of the Jews that was written by Flavius Josephus. And what he says was that Herod died around the time of a great lunar eclipse. And people, manuscripts that date after 1544 have had this copying error of Herod's death being in 4 BC. But if you look at the copies of Josephus that date prior to that, it appears that lunar eclipse that he's talking about actually occurred on January 10 in 1 BC. So that means that, Jesus, if he was born after 4 BC, then he could fit in with a census that was recorded for 3 BC. And we have Roman records now that have been found that indicate that there was a man named Quirinius. He held 2 titles. He was the legate of Caesar in Syria, and he was the prefect of the first Augustan cohort. Now, in the Roman province of Syria, which included Palestine, the Holy Land, the headquarters for that province was in Damascus. And that's where the Romans kept the majority of their legions for that region, because it was on the border with the Parthians, who were essentially modern-day Iranians. So that's where Quirinius would have been. And if he was the legate of Caesar, that means he was the senior person, the commander of all the legions in that area. And that does mean that he was the military governor of that province. So we have, and I'll show you pictures of these in a minute, of these records that confirm that. And we also have evidence that a formal census did take place in the year 3 BC. So that also would confirm what the Gospel of Luke says. The other thing is that a lot of Bible critics have said that Bethlehem itself did not even exist until the 1st century AD. But in reality, what we have found now is records of Jewish taxation that occurred back as far as the 7th century BC, and they have seals that came with goods that were part of the taxes paid from Bethlehem itself, mentioning the town itself. So any discussion that Bethlehem didn't exist in the 1st century AD has been refuted by that. So everyone knows about Caesar Augustus. He's a real historical figure. We have millions of his coins and statues and everything else, so that's not even a debate. Now, Quirinius, we have 2 inscriptions that have been found, both of them in the town of Antioch, Pisidia, which is in Turkey, the southern part of modern-day Turkey. The first one names Publius Sulpicius Quirinius as the chief magistrate. In other words, he is the governor for the Roman province of Syria. So that confirms that not only was he a real person, but he was the governor of that area. The second one is called the Aemilius Secundus inscription, and that states that this man, Aemilius Secundus, was commanded by Quirinius as the governor to conduct a census in a town within the Roman province of Syria called Apamea in the year 3 BC. And we have another record that shows that a second census, even larger census, was conducted in 6 AD. But if there was one in a Syrian town in 3 BC, the feeling is there was probably a general call for a census throughout that entire province in that year of 3 BC. And so there's some new evidence that at least shows that that also took place. And the last thing I want to show is this is one of the pieces of evidence that Bethlehem existed. This is a clay bulla, which is a seal just made out of unfired clay that was placed on a seals of documents, like a rolled up parchment or papyrus document. And then a ring or something was impressed into it that left writing. And this seal dates to either the 7th or 8th century BC, so 700 plus years before the Holy Family story. And it is part of a taxation that was paid by the citizens of Bethlehem to the government in Jerusalem at the time, to the king who was there. So it clearly shows that Bethlehem did not start sometime after the 1st BC, that there's actually recorded history of it going back as late as 700 BC. All right, the next part of the story that takes place in Bethlehem is, of course, where the holy couple winds up. And what the gospel says is when they got there, when they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she, Mary, gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. All right, that's what we all learned about, was the inn, and there was no room, so they were stuck out in some stable or something somewhere. Well, there's a church in Bethlehem called the Church of the Nativity. It was built in the 4th century AD over a cave, and I'll show you a picture of this. It was purported to be the place where Jesus was born. The location was confirmed in 150 AD by a major leader of the church at the time, Justin Martyr, as the place of the Nativity. He had been told by followers of the disciples, mainly John, that this was the location and where the place was. Now, in describing this, Luke uses the term kataluma. And kataluma is essentially the same word that he uses to describe the upper room that Jesus and his disciples used during the Last Supper. When Luke describes a true hotel, an inn, he uses the word pandokion, which is the same one that he uses in describing the story of the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan pays the bill and takes the injured person to a true hotel. Most 1st century AD houses in Israel were 2-story affairs. And the bottom story was where the open air cooking was done. It was also an area of storage, and especially for animals that were brought in during the night to keep them safe from predators. They were also housed on the lower floor, where the upper floor, and including the roof, is where people lived. So when Luke is saying kataluma, meaning that there wasn't any room there, what he's describing is one of these 2-story houses where Joseph had come to one of his relatives' houses, and there were already guests coming in from other places who had occupied the upper room, and the family was probably sleeping on the roof. And so there was no room for them in that upper room. However, there was room for them in the lower part of the house, which is where the animals had been pulled in and other things. So they weren't shuttled off to a barn. They actually were in a house. And this is the Church of the Nativity. It has two sections in a lower cave portion. This is a small cave area that is believed to be the place where Jesus was born. And they have a veneration spot done up with all this incense and jewelry and everything else here on the floor. But this is probably more like what the house looked like that Luke was describing. And you can see there's a little courtyard area down here. And then you can see the upper floor up here and then the roof area with ladders going up. And what he's saying is that for a Cataluma, this part was occupied, but the lower part where you see the person and leading the animals in was still available, although not prime area. But that's probably where the Holy Family was quartered when Jesus was born, in one of these houses that was a relative of Joseph. All right, the next part of the story that takes place in Bethlehem deals with the shepherds. And what the gospel says is there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people. Today, in the city of David, a Savior has been born to you, and he is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." All right. A manger clearly would have been the description of the lower floor of one of those houses I just showed you a picture of. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that you will find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes. And I will come back to that in a minute. Now, just north of Bethlehem, there is a place that's called Migdal Eder. And in Hebrew, that means the Tower of the Flock. And this is a field that traditionally, this is where Ruth, who is the great-grandmother of David and in the lineage that comes down through David to Jesus, met Boaz, who then became her husband. But during the 1st century AD, this field was owned by the temple itself in Jerusalem, which is some 5 miles to the north. And the field was tended by shepherds who raised sheep that were then to be used as sacrifices in the temple. And in the wintertime, when it was cold, lambs are born, and they're, of course, born very wet. And to protect them from freezing to death, the shepherds would take them to a very nearby cave and wrap them in swaddling clothes to keep them warm. Now, being told by the angel of the Lord that they would find God's Savior, the promised Messiah, wrapped in swaddling clothes, would have had a special meaning to these Levitical shepherds, because they would have related that meaning God's sacrifice for all of mankind, just like the sheep were sacrifices to God in the temple. This is the field itself at Migdal Eder. It's this long field that stretches through here, and I'm taking the photograph I took up above, and I will show you where that is here in a minute. But actually, when I was there in 2016, a shepherd came out with a whole flock of sheep, and it's still being used as a feeding area for sheep and shepherds use today. And just where I was taking the picture from, there is a large series of caves. And you can see this cave structure preserved here. Obviously, the columns have been put in later to help support it. But inside, you can see it's been turned into a church, but you can see the blackening of the ceiling of this from all the fires that the shepherds over the years had been burning in there to keep themselves warm and to eat something, but also to keep the young lambs warm as well as wrapping them in swaddling clothes to dry them off so they wouldn't freeze. The next stage of the gospel story then takes place 8 days after the birth of Jesus, when his family takes the baby, the 5-mile journey from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, to the temple to be purified. So what the gospel says is the following. When the time of their purification according to the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as has been written in the law of the Lord. Every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, that little verse has several key facts in it that I want you to look at. There are 3 things that are mentioned here. First of all, obviously his parents were devout Jews who took the law of Moses very seriously because they are obeying the law of coming to present their son to the Lord and offer purification sacrifices at the time that was prescribed in the book of Leviticus. The second thing is that Jesus had to have been born into a relatively poor family, because the traditional sacrifice was a 1-year-old lamb, but only if the family couldn't afford to buy a lamb could 2 birds, either doves or pigeons, be offered as a substitute. And the fact that the Bible mentions that 2 birds, first of all, that's a very historically accurate fact that really has nothing to do with the overall story, but provides a detail that can be shown to be true by temple records. And the third thing is the temple visited by Jesus is the same temple that he would then later visit as an adult in his life. And this was the second, or what's known as Herod's temple. And the southern steps, while the temple is gone now, part of the restraining wall that was built over Mount Moriah, where the temple is still there, as are the southern steps that led up to the platform where the temple once stood. And these are those steps. There are some 30 steps. They're 200 feet across, and they lead up to a gate that would have been right here going up to the Temple Mount. Now, that's part of a Islamic mosque that's up on there now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which you can see up here. But the temple would have been up on this, and I'll show you a reconstruction of that in a minute. And these are known as the Hulda, or the southern steps to the temple. And these would have been the same steps that Jesus would have walked up and then ascended to the Temple Mount. This is a model that's available at the Israel Museum, and it's looking down from the Mount of Olives. Those steps would have come in on this side over here. The temple faced east and sat in the middle of the Temple Mount. But this is actually a mountaintop. And Herod the Great, who ruled from 37 BC to about 1 BC when he passed away, built this huge restraining wall over the top of the mountain to create a flat platform so that the temple could be on it. And you'll see all those columns there that are on the backside. These are called Solomon's portico, and that's where the rabbis would sit and teach, and that is where Jesus would have sat and taught as well. This is what remains of the platform. Now, the building up on top was put in by the Ottoman Turks, who ruled Israel for almost a millennium, up until the end of World War I. But these large blocks down here are the remaining part of the original Herodian stones. And this is the area that's known as the Western or Wailing Wall, and is still there today. Now, that's what's exposed outside. If you go off to the left of this photo, there's actually a tunnel that goes down and exposes the huge stones that were put in as the foundation stones for this retainment. And this is pictures of me by it. The largest stone is this huge one here. It's all of this over here. It measures almost 45 feet in length and almost 10 feet high, and it's estimated to go back about 10 feet because obviously you can't see the whole stone because it's built back into Mount Moriah. But it's estimated to weigh about 570 tons. And to this day, no one has been able to figure out how Herod's engineers were able to cut such a stone and then move it into place. But clearly, somehow they did. And it's just an amazing structure. But dating to the 1st century AD, same time, Jesus would have walked by the area where I'm standing in that photo. All right, the next part of the story is the visit of the Magi and visiting with King Herod as well. So what the gospel says is after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." And then on coming to the house, notice it says house, not inn, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. All right, so we have several facts that are given here. We have Magi, we have King Herod, and then we have these gifts. So let's take a look at all of those. First of all, King Herod, otherwise known as Herod the Great, is a very well-known historical figure. There are many records written on him, both Roman as well as Jewish. There are monuments to him. There are many coins minted that bear testimony to his existence. So that's not really ever been questioned. Recently, archaeologists and primarily Ehud Netzer of Hebrew University in 2007, and he had been searching for this almost his whole adult life, he found a tomb on the side of the Herodium, and I will show you this. This is a structure that Herod had built, one of his palaces, and he found a tomb that he believed was the tomb of Herod the Great. And the sarcophagus, which is very ornate, is now on exhibit in the Israel Museum, and I will show you photos of that right here. This is the Herodium. It's about, maybe about 8 miles south of Jerusalem. It's a little bit south of Bethlehem, and it looks like a mountain, but this area out here is flat. This is a man-made mountain that looks like a volcano, and when you get to the top, it's hollowed out, and there were 4 watchtowers on this, and his palace structure, complete with baths and water systems pumping up water and everything, were down inside of this. And this is a place that Herod visited in the heat of the summer because it was cool down into this man-made mountain. Anyway, Ehud Netzer discovered on this side of the mountain an area where he thought was his tomb could be, and when he excavated it, they found this very large, ornate coffin made out of limestone with all these carved rosettes on it. Now, the normal person in the 1st century AD would have been buried in a rock-cut tomb, and a year later, his relatives would have come in after the body had essentially rotted and desiccated and collected the bones and put them in a bone box known as an ossuary that would have been, maybe 2 feet in length. So having something that's this huge, almost 6 feet across, this was a very important person. The interesting thing was that someone back in time had desecrated the tomb. The body was no longer there, and had smashed the sarcophagus into literally hundreds of pieces, which Netzer and his team put back together, but some of the pieces still weren't there. As you can see, they're missing in this area here. Now, the term magi itself, Matthew translates it as the wise men, but it means a bunch of things. It could be teachers, priests, physicians, astrologers, interpreters of dreams, soothsayers, all of these things. But there's one thing that's clear. It does not mean that they were rulers of any kind. They were not kings. When we call we three kings, that's really a misnomer. They were probably astrologers, which was a revered type of science of the day. And the number 3 comes to us, it's not mentioned in the Gospels. The Gospels simply refer to magi as plural from the word magnus, which is where we get the English word magic from. But the 3 comes solely from the 3 gifts that were given, with the assumption from a 5th century AD document from Egypt that each wise man brought a single gift. The Syrian Christian churches believe that there were 12. The other thing that's kind of tradition and not really backed by history are their names. Melchior, which is a Persian name, Gaspar or Caspar is Indian, and Balthasar is a Babylonian name. And these also only date to the 5th century AD. There's no tradition or anything that goes back to the time of the birth of Jesus that these were actually the names of the people. Now, the 3 gifts: gold, standing for wealth; frankincense as a offering to anointing for a deity; and myrrh, an anointing balm that was also used in anointing a body before it was buried. There are traditions that those 3 gifts were traditional gifts, a triad of gifts to a king. And they actually date, here we go, they date to back to 243 BC, when they were first given as a triad of gifts to King Seleucus II of essentially Greek Syria, who then placed them in the temple of the god Apollo. And after that, every king in the Middle East, when they would be given a special gift, it was always of these 3 things. So that has been established historically as a traditional gift for kings. Now, the 3 magi, probably on their journey from the east, coming from, if it was India and Babylonia and Persia, would have probably come to Jerusalem through the town of Petra in modern-day Jordan. And the reason for that is Petra owned the monopoly of trade on all these items. They were the north-south location for frankincense and myrrh trade coming from the Arabian Peninsula, and gold from Yemen also came north through there. So probably these 3 wise men came through Petra, purchased the 3 gifts there, and then continued on to Bethlehem. Now, the other thing Matthew uses is, in describing this, he uses the word paidion to describe Jesus. Paidion is not the Greek word that is used to describe either a baby or a young boy of like 4, 5, or 6 years old, but it really means, it should be translated as toddler. And it really referred to a child who was older than a baby, but less than about 2 years old. And this may be the reason that King Herod, when he gives the order to have all the children in Bethlehem and the surrounding area under the age of 2 killed, is because the wise men probably didn't arrive right after the birth, but within about 2 years of Jesus' birth. And of course, we know that as the slaughter of the innocents. This is the Treasury building, which really isn't a treasury. It's called that because the early explorers thought it was, but it's really just a tomb that sits in Petra. Petra, of course, is in a canyon, and all the buildings are carved into the wall of the canyon in this red sandstone. And of course, this is a famous building that's in the third Indiana Jones movie that everyone has seen. But this is where the trade for those 3 artifacts would have been. Now, the very last part of the story is the flight to Egypt. And this is kind of the oft-forgotten part. So when they had gone, meaning the wise men had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child and kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and during the night and left for Egypt. When he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled. The Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." All right. This is, as I said, the oft-forgotten last part of it. We don't know where the Holy Family would have gone in Egypt, but it is likely they settled near Heliopolis along the Nile. Why? There was a large community of Jews in Heliopolis because of the presence of the Temple of Onias. This was a very large Hellenistic and Roman age Jewish temple that was the only place of worship outside of Jerusalem where sacrifices were officially offered to God. Synagogues did not have sacrifices. That was only in the temple. But the Temple of Onias here in Egypt also had that. And it existed from 173 BC to 73 AD, so for 243 years. And it was serviced by priests from the family of this wealthy Jew named Onias. And being a devout Jew, as we have already seen, Joseph probably would have taken his family to a place where they would have been, one, with other Jews, and two, where they had the ability to worship God and make sacrifices at the temple. And the ruins of the Jewish temple at Onias near Heliopolis exist today. And you can see them. They're in the same big, large limestone blocks like the temple in Jerusalem, although the structure is different. It is not a elongate rectangular building like the one in Jerusalem, but is more of a tower type square building. But nonetheless, this is where I believe they would have gone, simply because it makes sense religiously as well as community-wise, where Joseph would have gone to escape the potential death of his son from the order of King Herod. So, what do we draw from all this? Well, the Christmas story is, when you really read it through the Gospels, it's really steeped in history. There are a large number of people and places and things that are mentioned, many of which have been verified by archaeology. The writings of a number of ancient historians, such as Pliny and Suetonius and Josephus, as well as in the Talmud, all confirm that Jesus was a true historical figure. But none of this proves the Bible. We live in a society today that, we're taught from scientific method that everything needs to be proved, and if it can't be proved, it needs to be questioned. But what I take out of this, being a scientist myself, is that I think it shows that the Bible is historically fairly reliable when it describes events and the life and times and places in the life of Jesus. But at the end of the day, belief is still always going to be a matter of faith. You're never going to have, and I tell this, I've been teaching an adult Sunday school class for 32 years, and I tell my class all the time that, yes, I'm an archaeologist, but don't expect archaeology to prove every single thing that's in the Bible. No fact of archaeology can ever do that. And as I said, we live in a world that seeks to have proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, just believe. Believe in him and what he said. So to me, my final takeaway from this is the truly good news of Christmas is what the angels told the shepherds. For unto you a Savior has been born. He is Christ the Lord. And with that, I conclude my talk. I'd be glad to answer any questions if you have questions. So I'll leave it there, and Jennifer can relate them to me.
Yes, if you do have any questions, just use that chat on the bottom left of your screen. Just type it in, and then we can, I'll ask those questions for you. I'm going to open this real quick. So I do know that someone was having some problems seeing the images on their phone. We are actually recording this session, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on the museum's Facebook page with this entire presentation. And so what I'll do is I have the email address of the person who's having a hard time seeing the images. So I'll send you a link to that presentation once it's up on our YouTube channel. And then you can see the whole thing there again if you like. And if anybody else had problems seeing the images, if you're on a phone, your screen was just small, send me your email here right now, and I'll make sure to get you on the list and send you the link as well. So, but again, if you have questions, please type them in. Make sure it's either to everyone or to all panelists. We'll see it, and then we can relate those. And I just want to remind everybody that we will have more virtual programs. We have a genealogy one focused on your family history in January. But then in March, we'll actually have a speaker who will talk about the Texas independence. So be sure to look at our website and check out our Facebook page for those events. You'll have to register just like you did here and then log in, but it will be a virtual free event. So I'm not seeing any questions at this time. Does anybody have any questions as far as the presentation? Did you have any questions? Okay. I know I had one question. You were talking about in the beginning that second house that was found under the convent, you said that was more for maybe a more notable person. How could you tell that was for a more notable person?
Well, let me see if I can go back to it.
I was just curious.
Yeah. It actually has to do with the size and the masonry. Let me see if I can find it again.
Yeah, it was in the beginning.
Well, I seem to be going backwards. Okay. Hold on a second. Okay. Let me get it back full screen. Whoops. Other one. There we go. This is a elongate photo of it. The house actually goes way back here to the right and way back to the left. But it seems to have almost a pavement within the house. Almost all the houses of the first century would have had essentially just dirt floors, compacted dirt floors, maybe plastered a little bit, but this one had a rock floor. It also had some very large stones in here, which they believe may have had to do with like food preparation, like serving as a serving table or something like that. But that's very unusual for all the houses. And so the conclusion drawn is that the person who lived in this house. Now, remember, Nazareth in the 1st century AD, while it existed, it was kind of a backwater. Estimates of population size would have been something on the order of 300 to 400 people. So, relatively small town. So to have a building like this, this probably would have been like the mayor of Nazareth's place. It would have been probably something much better than Joseph or would have been able to afford. Although he could have built something like this, and maybe had participated in the construction of such a home.
Okay.
But that's the real reason for it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We do have one other question. Someone mentioned that they have also heard that the 3 magi came from Europe, one from Africa, and one from Persia. Is there any evidence of that?
That's modern tradition. The modern tradition has the 3 magi of 3 separate ages, one being 20, 140, and 160, to represent the 3 ages of mankind. Youth, middle age, and old age. There's no tradition even from the 5th century AD for that. They also now depict one of them as being black, coming from Ethiopia, but they retain the name Balthasar for him, and Balthasar is a Babylonian name. So, why you would have had someone coming from Ethiopia whose name was Babylonian doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think the general tradition is that the words that is used in the gospel describes them coming from the east in the same context that you would describe from the rising of the sun. So Europe is clearly to the north, all right? And Europe at this time, was Roman world and or, barbarian, Dacian, modern day Romania or German territory. So the scholars would have come from India, Persia, and Babylon. That's where the seat of this astrology learning was. So I think the tradition is stronger and makes more sense historically that they would have come from those eastern countries around Mesopotamia than coming from other regions.
Thank you. Any other questions? You said thank you for your answer and the presentation. Another one said they didn't have questions, but they really enjoyed the presentation, that it was very well made. So thank you.
I'm glad they got something out of it.
All right. If you have any other questions, just go ahead and post it now. Otherwise, I think we will go ahead and call it. Again, if you want to see the copy of this presentation on our YouTube page, be sure to send me your email address and I will send you the link. Okay, at the end. It may not be tomorrow, but it'll probably be at least next week at the latest to have it up. So you will get an email though once it's posted. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I want to thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge in this presentation. I know I learned a lot and thoroughly enjoyed it.
All right, well, Merry Christmas to everybody.
Merry Christmas.